Hello, this is Kate Krantz. I am going to be talking about my creative project I've been working on this semester. I decided to do the four different artists and try to mimic a portrait of a certain environment at CSUN that would replicate what each of these artists had in their techniques and skills. So the first one I will talk about is Hu Yiqian. He was relatively known for his work to revive woodcut movement during a chaotic time in a dividing China during the 1930s. It was a time period when the woodcut movement was revolutionizing to inform the Chinese people of certain political propaganda messages. Once the wood block is carved, it is easy to reprint. So it's easier to have access to whatever the message is. There's no need for language to portray certain moods or emotions. And most of these woodcuts at these time periods were a little exaggerated to reference the suffering that was going on during that time period. One of the inspirational pictures that I used of Hu Yiqian's is his 1932 To the Front. It shows a sense of desperation to rally the citizens of China to a new front. Like I said, during the 1930s, there was chaos. It was a time when the government officials abandoned the people to conquering Japanese army. And in its wake, it was created a rise in interest of communist ideals that sprang up throughout the countryside that was being taken over. So for my picture, I decided to re-implement a woodblock that's similar to the front, as I gave myself kind of an over-exaggeration expression to the cries of food. I kept with the figure to kind of keep it clean, but also still have certain small details that would kind of give more character, like having pockets and adding flower details. To contrast this, I made sure that the layering was still effective. So I have mostly black background, but because of my lighter features, I decided to go with a black shirt just so that way there is this sense of layering that you're able to still see the form. And, I also try to keep in mind of what would be easy to carve out, as most of what I have done is on digital. I had to keep in mind of what would be the easy solution of carving, and I decided to at least keep the shirt black. Now, while the shirt is black, I decided to have my pants white. I do have white pants. So, just to kind of give it more of a variety, I guess you could say, and still have something that would still reference to what would be seen in these woodcut prints. So for the background, I decided to have it be at the Arbor Grill, right with the giant pavilion gazebo. It's a really interesting angle. I try to keep in mind of what kind of angle would be artistically ideal. So I also wanted to include the flowers and the vines that grow up to the top that creates the shading. I try to keep it a really nice texture with it too. Try to keep it, like I said, what is realistic to be carved, but at the same time still give it a depth of space a little bit. And to give it a little bit more of a border of composition, I kind of included the corner of the bushes right behind the figure. It kind of keeps it uniformed in some ways. And when I created this, they also had a little bit of wavy lines with it too. So it kind of added a nice texture and detail to the work. All right, so for the second one, I decided to go with Li Shutun for my inspiration, and I took note of how he was the pioneer of Chinese artists that looked to Western culture for inspiration. He was particularly inspired by Impressionist paintings movements of the line dabs and colors blended together to create an image with the forms. And it was one of the first of many Western influences that impacted Chinese art. As the West was past the Impressionist period, the idea of studying color and light was a new concept for the Chinese. With previous history, the Chinese was mostly still and literary paintings, stylistic wise, while the Impressionist was going on. But by the time that Li Shutan came, he had a curiosity of the Western art. So he was very inspired by Impressionists at the time when the Chinese were still holding on to their traditional art. Taking inspiration from Li Shutan's half-naked woman, I used a similar pose that the artist placed the woman in the painting. I noticed that this painting, it seemed to have more of a play of experimenting with light, shadow, and color. I decided to go with a different type of lighting source, but I try to implement this on my piece as I go back and forth between dabbing and blending on digitally. Then I would blend it together and then repeat by dabbing more brush strokes on. I would repeat this process until I got to where I'm at right now. With most Impressionist paintings, it is about the experiment of color to have the viewer's eye play tricks to create the figure in the image to appear. As such, with the features of the skin, hair, and eyes, it is about the understanding of layers and undertones of color. As with my hair, technically it is considered a blonde, but over the years, I have understood that I seem to have some red and darker brown mixed in it. So to separate the effect of a typical lighter blonde hair color, I included mixing different variations of color to create something that is similar to my actual hair color. As with the eyes, I technically have green color, but it is also a hue of mix up between the blue and gold specks between that creates the illusion of green eyes. So I try to implement that into my painting too, even if it's a small detail. As with the skin, I might have some pink hues, but I have a cool undertone, so I included blue into the skin and other parts that might reflect off the lighting. With the background in Half-Naked Woman, the model was closely to the front of the wall. So to create this intimate atmosphere, I placed myself in front of the wall with the sign hanging in the top left corner. For the sign, it indicated that it's at the Fruity and Sip, but I kind of wanted it to still have that mysterious vibe to it. So I kind of just cut off part of the sign just so that way it's more about the focus of the character than the setting. So for my third painting is the inspiration of Xu Beihong. The artist was about bringing in a new quality to the traditional ink paintings, well, most known for his horse ink paintings. For Xu Beihong, the artist is about bringing in a new quality to the traditional ink paintings, and he is mostly well known for his horse ink paintings. There was a certain type of expression used with his paintings that gave the characters in the image more life to the paintings. Compared to past ink paintings, Xu Beihong seems to have an understanding and knowledge of perspective that gave everything in his painting a spirit that traditional paintings and ink paintings just had a flatter effect to. With the use of applying the right amount of water to his brushes, Xu Beihong was able to give shading and value to his paintings. In the portrait I did, I looked to many of Xu Beihong's horse paintings, but the ones that I gravitated to was mostly kind of more colorful, like the Three Galloping Horses. I admired the light blend of the ink and the colors chosen for the paintings, as it gave a carefree atmosphere. To try to have a similar effect to the horses' characters, I would try to have a lighter version of a black to give the figure more depth. It would help with the shading of the character, yet I precisely made sure not to overdo with the shading because I still wanted to keep it look like something similar to what Beihong's ink paintings had. Since there was color in this painting, I decided to have a little color involved with my painting too. Trying to imitate the washed out ink effect, I made sure that the paint selection I had on my Photoshop had the overlaying lucent effect. For certain parts, there was less blending than other parts, depending on the detail. With the hair, I had more detail to add lines and a bit of shading, yet with the shirt, I gave the edges a bleeding effect to create different textures to the surface, as I did the same thing with the grass next to the sidewalk. With the background, because my figure has a flatter image, I decided to include something with a little bit more depth of space by adding a point perspective. To clarify the space, the CSUN location I chose is at the market that happens every Tuesday right next to the CSUN Union. For the stands and sidewalk, I decided to have gray coloring as they're kind of a lifeless feature compared to the other objects, as such as with the grass or the actual figure of the person. To imitate a similar paper quality, I changed my backdrop to a color that is washed out yellow to have an age effect yet rustic look to it. Lastly, for Yu Mingchen, he is a prominent Chinese artist during the 1990s, during a time when cynical art was happening thanks to the 1989 events. Yu Mingchen, whether he intended to or not, contributed to a cynical approach to his paintings. His paintings were exaggerated of a reflection of himself holding a laughing pose that seemed kind of ingenuine and extreme. So extreme that it gave a sense of fear for the audience. For most of his work, it would have mostly a surrealistic background kind of theme. There was still a sense of realism, but it kind of had that dreamlike state background. So, for example, he would mostly have a lot of skies. So I kind of looked to a lot of his paintings with sky backdrops as part of my inspiration. With this, combining with the extreme pigmentation of the skin, it created an unsettling approach to the paintings. For this portrait, I had to keep in mind that while Yu Mingchen's work is exaggerated, he still had a realistic approach to his paintings. As I was painting my picture, I started to paint with an exaggerated pink tones to work with, as it created my facial structure. Over time, I realized that the skin was not the same quality of Yu Mingchen, so I had to change the hue to kind of create a more of a purple into the mix. And the result is much closely linked to Yu Mingchen's. While creating the facial expression, I knew I needed to have a over-exaggerated look, but I wanted to almost have a painful look to the paintings. To implement this, I overemphasized certain proportions, like the length of the nose, less of a forehead, and a creepy looking smile. With the exception of the skin and the facial expression, Yu Mingchen seems to have every other part of the body have more of a realistic approach. So I gave softer texture to my hair and eyes, and the shirt as I blended the colors softly. I made sure to have some value to the features to give it a realistic perspective of space. Behind the figure, knowing that most of Yu Mingchen had sky in his background, as mentioned before, I decided to try to contrast it with an interior space to create Behind the figure, keep in mind of Yu Mingchen's surrealistic background, I had sky in place with it. But to show the location at the school, I decided to use the library as it was the location that I spent most of my time in the semester. Instead of having the exterior of the building being shown, I decided to just paint 2 bookshelves to create a certain illusion to the atmosphere. In the sky above the shelves, I painted soft clouds to have more of a surrealistic effect to the mood of the painting. Keep in mind, all of my paintings were done on Photoshop, so I was a little limited on the skills that I was able to do to implement certain techniques that would have been easier to do if it was in real format. But I still learned a lot of the process, and it's something that I would like to continue to learn more about.